So if you're listening to this deep dive right now, you are probably someone who, enjoys looking for those massive aha moments, those structural shifts that completely change how you view the way the world actually works.
Right, the kind of things that are hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. Hiding in plain sight, usually buried under a mountain of impenetrable financial jargon. But today, our mission is to cut through all of that, because we are exploring a truly radical blueprint for redesigning modern capitalism.
It's a huge topic. We are basically looking at a system that tries to answer a seemingly impossible question, like how do we keep the unstoppable, world-changing innovation of these visionary founders, but simultaneously mathematically solve the problem of infinite wealth hoarding?
Yeah, and the source we're unpacking today is just fascinating. It's a single article from April 8th, 2026. The author is Paramendra Kumar Bhagat, and it's titled Redefining Founder Power, Capping Wealth to Unleash Lasting Impact.
And I have to say the tone of this piece is wild because it completely straddles two different universes.
Oh, totally. One page is deep into Delaware corporate law and venture capital term sheets. And the next page hits you with this sweeping, almost prophetic vision. I mean, the very first line of the article is, the impending age of abundance was prophesied in the scriptures thousands of years ago.
Which is just an incredibly bold way to open a discussion on, like, corporate equity engineering.
Yeah, you don't normally see that in a business journal.
Right, but it immediately signals that the author views the legal machinery of capitalism as something more than just a neutral tool. It's a system that can actually be recoded to trigger a civilizational shift.
But, and I want to be really clear with you listening, we are looking at this purely as a structural thought experiment. The source material obviously touches on politically charged topics, billionaire wealth, economic inequality, redistribution.
And people have very strong feelings about those things.
Exactly. So just a quick impartiality note. We aren't taking sides here. We're not endorsing the politics. We're just acting as impartial guides to the author's mechanics. We want to pressure test the actual structure they're proposing.
Yeah, we want to see if the engine actually works. And the best place to start that pressure test is with the author's diagnosis of the current corporate landscape, which they argue is basically split in two.
Okay, lay that out for us.
So on one side, you have your traditional corporate structures. These are companies optimized entirely for quarterly returns. They're engineered to just squeeze out incremental profit every 3 months.
To keep the institutional shareholders happy. The traditional corporate grind.
Right, exactly. But then on the other side, you have the moonshot companies.
The ones trying to electrify the global auto fleet or build artificial general intelligence.
Yeah, or establish interplanetary logistics. And the driving force behind those moonshots is almost exclusively the modern founder CEO.
Which naturally brings us to Elon Musk. The author relies on him heavily as the archetype here. And it makes perfect sense because Musk illustrates both the unbelievable output of this model, but also the extreme tension it creates.
The text points out that his influence isn't just because he's a famous guy with a big microphone. The influence is literally hard-coded into his ownership.
Right. The author cites the estimates, which obviously fluctuate, but notes Musk holding roughly 13% of Tesla and something like 40% or more of SpaceX.
And those percentages, they represent a concentration of power that allows one single individual to command global capital markets. He can steer multi-decade strategies without constantly answering to, like, a diffuse, risk-averse board of investors.
And the author has a very specific word for this level of ownership. They say it doesn't just create wealth, it creates gravity.
Gravity, yeah, it's such a physical concept to applied finance.
It really is. It implies the wealth isn't just sitting in a vault like Scrooge McDuck. It's a mass that literally warps the environment around it. It pulls talent and policy and other capital right into its orbit.
Precisely. And the author breaks down this gravity, this founder power, into a three-part equation. It's not simply about looking at someone's net worth on Forbes.
Okay, so what are the three parts?
So the first two parts are fairly standard. You have share ownership, which is the economic right, just the actual percentage of the company's financial value that you own.
Right.
Then you have voting control. Those are the decision-making rights. We see this all the time with dual-class share structures. A founder might only own, say, 10% of the economic value, but they hold 55% of the voting power.
So they can't be fired by an activist hedge fund.
Exactly. But the third variable in the author's equation is the really interesting one. They call it the silent amplifier, and that is liquidity scale.
Okay, we really need to dig into the mechanics of that because I think a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand how billionaires actually function day to day.
Yeah, they imagine checking accounts with 10 digits.
Right. But the liquidity scale is the freedom to convert equity into usable capital. If you have $100 billion in stock, you aren't literally selling that stock to like buy a social media platform or fund a
No.
space program.
Because if you sell, you trigger a massive capital gains tax event. And even worse, you lose your voting power. You dilute your own control over the company.
Which completely defeats the purpose. So instead, you use the liquidity scale. You go to a massive institutional bank and you use that massive block of shares as collateral for a portfolio loan.
The classic buy, borrow, die strategy.
Exactly. You get billions in cash entirely tax-free because loans aren't taxed as income, and you still hold all your shares. The sheer scale of your equity gives you access to effectively infinite liquidity without ever giving up an ounce of control.
And that specific mechanism is how wealth transitions into actual geopolitical leverage. The author points to the reality of what happens when a single founder has access to that kind of liquidity.
Right, they can do things that previously only nations could do.
Yeah. They fund private space programs that outpace NASA. They buy global communications infrastructure. They literally reshape the defense capabilities of nations in active conflict zones.
Which really forces the core question of this whole section. If individuals possess the geopolitical leverage of sovereign nations, wielding private sovereign capital without any democratic oversight or public mandates or term limits, where does power actually reside?
And historically, we've been, acutely paranoid about that level of concentrated power in politics. We design entire constitutions with checks and balances specifically to prevent it.
But in the economic realm, we just kind of shrug. Or we actively build financial ecosystems to accelerate it.
Right. But, and I know you're going to push back here.
I am. Because, okay, if we are actually pressure testing this, we have to look at the flip side. Isn't that extreme concentration of capital exactly what is required to build a SpaceX?
You're saying you can't get to Mars by committee.
Exactly. You cannot build a reusable orbital rocket if you have to satisfy a board of directors demanding a dividend check every 90 days. You need a singular visionary who has both the absolute dictatorial authority and the massive capital required to push through, like 10 years of exploding rockets. If we mess with that concentration, don't we risk breaking the innovation engine entirely?
That is honestly the strongest defense of the current system. And the crazy part is, the author actually completely concedes the point.
Wait, really? The author agrees with that?
Totally. The text states explicitly, in many cases, founder control is what enables bold innovation. The argument is not that we should strip founders of their power and hand these companies over to bureaucratic committees.
Okay, so if the author accepts that the dictatorial control of a visionary founder is a feature, not a bug, what exactly are we trying to fix here?
And that brings us to the central thesis of the piece. The author asks a really specific question. Can we preserve founder control while redesigning founder enrichment?
Preserve the control, redesign the enrichment. So decouple the power to steer the ship from the right, to hoard all the treasure you find along the way.
Precisely.
But, I mean, that challenges the most foundational premise of capitalism, doesn't it? The core assumption is that risk and reward have to be perfectly correlated. If you take the insane risk and you make the brilliant decisions, the infinite financial upside is the carrot that keeps you running.
Right, but the author challenges that assumption by looking closely at the actual psychology of the people building these massive entities. If you're a standard executive managing a mature legacy company, your incentive is absolutely short-term extraction. You want a stock price to spike so your options vest and you can retire to a golf course.
Sure.
But the visionary founder making multi-decade civilizational bets operates on a completely different psychological profile.
I mean, they aren't sleeping on the factory floor for 3 years just so they can buy a slightly larger yacht. They're doing it to put a dent in the universe. They want to change history.
Yeah, exactly. The author is suggesting that we can preserve that long-term history-altering drive without the toxic byproduct of creating a class of trillionaires. The dictatorial control is mathematically necessary for the vision to succeed. The infinite personal extraction is not.
I see. The text frames it as keeping the visionary steering wheel while redirecting the overflow fuel.
Yeah, that's the exact phrasing.
Let's actually visualize that, because decoupling is a pretty dry term for something that would fundamentally alter the global economy.
It's a great analogy. Go for it.
So imagine a cutting-edge hypercar. The founder is the driver. They hold the steering wheel. They decide the destination. They control the acceleration. They navigate the turns. They have absolute unquestioned authority over the vehicle.
And the engine of that car represents the company's innovation, right? Its market dominance, the actual products it builds.
Right. Under the current model, the faster the car goes, the more fuel, meaning the wealth generated, gets pumped into a storage tank strapped to the roof of the car. And eventually, the car is going 250 miles an hour, but there's a billion-gallon tank crushing the roof. It warps the chassis, it's a massive systemic risk, and frankly, the driver doesn't need a billion gallons of fuel to keep driving.
So what's the author's alternative?
The author is basically proposing we install a governor on the engine. But, crucially, and this is the key, a governor that does not restrict the RPMs or the speed of the vehicle.
Right, you don't put a block under the gas pedal. The car still runs at absolute maximum capacity.
Exactly. But the governor captures the excess exhaust heat, the kinetic energy that goes way beyond what the vehicle actually requires to function. And it redirects that energy outward to power the electrical grid of a surrounding city block.
The driver is still in total control. The company is still dominating the market.
Yep. But the byproduct, the overflow fuel, is automatically routed into a public utility rather than just expanding that tank on the roof until it crushes the car.
It's a really compelling visualization because it highlights that the innovation engine is left entirely intact. The surplus flows outward systemically instead of upward, individually.
But, and here is where the skeptic in me flares right back up. It's a great hypercar metaphor. But how do you actually mandate that the exhaust heat powers the city block?
What do you mean?
I mean, in the real world, the driver just unbolts the governor, throws it in the trash, or gets out and walks away. How do you legally enforce this without destroying the incentive to start the car in the first place? And this has to be more than a philosophical wish.
It is, and this is where the article shifts from moral philosophy to hardcore structural mechanics. The author introduces a framework they call equity engineering.
Equity engineering.
Yeah, and they are absolutely adamant that this isn't science fiction, and it isn't a plea for heavy-handed government intervention. It is simply a matter of rewriting corporate paperwork.
Paperwork. You mean cap tables, bylaws, shareholder agreements, corporate charters. The fundamental code that tells a company how to exist.
Right. The structures we use today, where all the surplus value accrues infinitely to the shareholders and the founder, those aren't laws of physics. They are design choices made by lawyers and financiers decades ago. And the author's point is, we can simply make different design choices.
Okay, so the text details two specific mechanisms for this, right? Voluntary investor return caps and founder wealth ceilings.
Let's start with the investors, specifically the venture capital model.
How exactly do you cap a VC?
Well, first you have to understand the brutal math of traditional venture capital. A VC fund might invest in 50 startups. 45 of them will basically go to zero, 3 will break even, and 2 will become massive unicorn hits.
Because the failure rate is so incredibly high, those 2 winners have to return, like 100x or 1,000x the initial investment just to make the entire fund profitable.
Exactly. The author notes the winner must win without limit because the losers will lose completely.
So the entire asset class currently relies on infinite upside.
Right, but the author suggests a structural modification. Imagine a startup raising a Series A round. The founders present a term sheet to the VCs, but it has a contractual cap on returns built in. Let's say it's a 20x multiple.
Now, to be clear for anyone listening, a 20x return is an astronomical win in literally any other asset class. If I put $10 million into your startup and you give me $200 million back a few years later, my limited partners are absolutely ecstatic.
Oh, it is a massive victory. The investors still win huge. They just don't win infinitely. The contract stipulates that once the investor's equity crosses that specific 20x threshold, any subsequent value created by those shares automatically converts.
Converts into what?
It transfers into a foundation tied to the company's mission or perhaps into an employee equity pool. The surplus is automatically redirected.
Okay, and then you apply a similar mechanism to the founder, but instead of a return multiple, it's a hard dollar ceiling.
Yeah, the author gives examples. A voluntary personal wealth cap of $50 million, $100 million, even $1 billion.
And the moment the founder's equity value hits that ceiling, the exact same mechanism triggers. Every additional dollar of value generated automatically vests into a foundation.
But, and I cannot emphasize this enough because it's the linchpin of the whole argument, the voting rights remain fully intact.
The voting rights don't transfer to the foundation.
No. The founder does not lose their board seat. They don't lose their super voting shares. The dictatorial control required for innovation is untouched. Only the financial accumulation is redirected.
That's fascinating.
The author explicitly states this is not anti-capitalism. It is capitalism with an engineered ceiling on personal extraction and no ceiling on impact.
We're rewriting the software,
Yeah.
not destroying the computer. And to be fair to the author, the text points out that we actually already have the legal precedent for this kind of thing.
We do.
Like, if you go to Delaware corporate court today, you can incorporate a public benefit corporation, a PBC. By law, a PBC's board of directors is required to balance the financial interests of the shareholders with the best interests of those materially affected by the corporation's conduct.
Exactly. We also have B corporations, mission-driven LLCs, cooperatives, employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs. The legal scaffolding to recognize stakeholders beyond just the financial extractor, it already exists.
And even dual-class shares already prove we can completely sever economic ownership from voting control. Like, Mark Zuckerberg controls Meta with a fraction of the total equity because his specific shares carry 10 times the voting weight.
Right.
So the Lego bricks to build this equity-engineered company are sitting right there on the table.
The author is simply taking those existing bricks and assembling a much more surgical, high-powered engine.
Okay, I hear the legal argument, it's sound. But let's look at the actual market dynamics. Because if I am a ruthless, rational allocator of capital, let's say I manage a massive pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund, and I have capital to deploy, I'm looking at two startups.
Okay.
Startup A has this new, enlightened 20x return cap. Startup B is a traditional, uncapped entity. Why on earth would I ever voluntarily choose Startup A? It violates my fiduciary duty to intentionally limit my upside. How does the author reconcile this without relying on, Wall Street investors suddenly developing a moral conscience?
It's definitely the critical vulnerability of the model if you only view it through the lens of short-term extraction. The author does frame this as a voluntary modification that will appeal to a new class of capital.
Impact investors.
Yeah, but beyond just impact investors, there is actually a deeply rational macroeconomic argument for this.
Which is?
Extreme inequality creates systemic macroeconomic risk. It destabilizes democracies, it crushes consumer demand, it creates incredibly volatile markets. Enlightened self-interest suggests that capping your return at 20x to ensure the underlying society remains stable is actually a better long-term bet than extracting 1,000x in a society that literally collapses under the weight of inequality.
I see the logic there, but honestly, I think the stronger argument the text implies is about talent acquisition.
How so?
Think about it. If you were a world-class software engineer, like the top 0.1% in your field, you have your pick of where to work. Are you going to go work for the uncapped startup knowing that your 80-hour work weeks are primarily functioning to buy the founder their 5th super yacht?
Probably not.
Right. Or do you go to the capped startup, where you know with absolute mathematical certainty that every ounce of surplus value you create is going to fund global public health or green infrastructure?
That is the competitive wedge. The cap actually becomes an asymmetrical advantage in talent acquisition and brand loyalty.
Exactly. If the capped startup attracts the absolute best engineers and the most fiercely loyal customers, it will inevitably outcompete the uncapped startup. The investors accept a 20x cap because it's attached to the team that is guaranteed to win the market.
It shifts it from a moral plea to a highly tactical market strategy. And the author points out where this isn't just theoretical dorm room philosophy. Section 4 of the piece details real-world precedents, taking us out of Silicon Valley and looking at developing economies.
Yeah, I found this part really grounding. The text highlights entrepreneurs in places like Nepal and India who are actively experimenting with these profit-first, purpose-second models.
And to be clear, these aren't nonprofits.
No, not at all. They are aggressive, high-growth businesses that generate real profit, repay their investors, and then legally mandate the routing of surplus revenue into social goods. Free clinics, community education, public health infrastructure.
And the author draws a very sharp line here between this structural approach and traditional corporate philanthropy. They use this great phrase, charity stapled onto capitalism after the fact.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates the traditional corporate social responsibility, or CSR, model.
It really does.
I mean, traditional CSR is a fossil fuel company making $30 billion, extracting resources, fighting carbon regulations for a decade, and then donating $5 million to build a community park so they can run a national television ad campaign about how green they are.
It's an afterthought. It's literally a PR expense line item.
Exactly. It is entirely external to the business model. But the author argues that these new equity-engineered models represent capitalism with an internal circulatory system.
The social impact isn't a discretionary donation authorized by the board at the end of a good quarter. It is the blood pumping through the veins of the corporate structure from day one.
And the mechanics they describe for this are remarkably simple, too. At the exact moment of incorporation, when the founders are dividing up the pie, the company simply grants a 10% equity stake outright to a nonprofit foundation.
It's literally just a line item on the initial cap table. But the downstream implications of that are staggering, because that foundation holds its stake permanently. So, as the company scales from a $10 million valuation to a $10 billion valuation, the foundation's balance sheet scales right along with it.
And when the company eventually issues dividends, the foundation receives those dividends exactly like a traditional investor would.
This is where the math gets incredibly powerful. Think about it. A traditional charity is trapped in a perpetual state of begging.
Yeah, they spend half their operating budget throwing fancy galas to convince wealthy donors to write checks for the next year.
Exactly. But a foundation that owns a 10% equity stake in a productive, dividend-yielding, high-growth asset, it doesn't need to beg. The author describes it as becoming a perpetual engine. It is financially self-sustaining.
Think about how that fundamentally alters the power dynamics of global philanthropy. The foundation is no longer a passive, grateful recipient of leftover wealth handed down by a billionaire in their twilight years. It is an active shareholder in the engine of wealth creation itself.
And the text grounds this with vivid examples of what those foundation dividends could structurally fund, like a super app for rural Nepal that provides unified access to digital banking, healthcare, and agricultural data.
Or a prop tech platform in India that deploys low-cost mud and bamboo architecture to create sustainable, scalable housing.
These aren't temporary aid packages. They are structural, civilizational investments funded entirely by the structural surplus of high-growth tech companies.
The author uses a really powerful metaphor here, calling it reinvested oxygen. Let's actually expand on that for a second. Think of a closed-loop life support system on a deep space station. You have a massive industrial machine running, and as a byproduct of its operation, it generates pure oxygen. Under our current economic system, we basically just open a valve and vent that excess oxygen out into the void of space.
Into infinite offshore bank accounts, dead real estate portfolios, speculative assets that don't do anything for the real economy.
Right, we are venting the life support of the economy into the void. The author is simply saying, take the vent, plug it back into the cabin, and let the crew breathe. Reinvest the oxygen.
So we see how this functions on a localized scale with startups in Nepal. But the author pushes the thought experiment to its absolute limit. They take this exact legal blueprint, the wealth cap and the foundation equity, and apply it to the largest, most complex corporate empire on the planet.
They apply it to Elon Musk. Because if you want to stress test a theory, you apply it to the ultimate apex founder. Let's walk through the exact mechanics of this hypothetical.
Okay, so the author proposes applying a hard $10 billion personal wealth cap to Musk.
Which, just to pause for reality for a second, $10 billion is an unfathomable amount of capital. It is generational dynastic wealth. You could purchase entire islands, fund private armies, and live like a literal emperor, and you would still never spend it all in your lifetime.
Right. Nobody's being forced into austerity here. The ceiling is high enough to eliminate any rational financial anxiety.
So under this model, Musk's equity crosses that $10 billion threshold. What structurally changes regarding his control of Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and the rest?
According to the text, absolutely nothing.
He keeps every single voting share. He retains every board seat. He commands the exact same strategic authority.
The steering wheel remains firmly in his grip, but every single dollar of value created by those companies that pushes his personal equity above that $10 billion mark automatically vests into a foundation.
And the author suggests this foundation could be controlled by him, right? Or by a consortium of his companies, or structured as an independent public trust.
Yes. Which prompts the immediate, visceral question from anyone steeped in free market capitalism. Wouldn't this instantly destroy his motivation?
Oh, absolutely. If you tell a guy who works 100-hour weeks, sleeping on factory floors, that he will never make another personal dime off his labor, doesn't he just go play golf?
The author answers that with a flat. Unlikely.
And why? What is the psychological defense for that?
Well, it comes down to the nature of extreme founder motivation. The text points out that Musk himself has consistently framed his drive in purely civilizational terms. He states his goal is to accelerate the advent of sustainable energy and ensure the light of consciousness survives by making humanity multiplanetary.
So if we take him at his word, If the motivation is truly the mission and not the personal financial scoreboard, then capping his personal wealth wouldn't weaken the mission at all.
The author actually goes a step further. They argue the cap would sharpen the mission. They introduce a fascinating psychological critique of extreme wealth. The text suggests that past a certain threshold, wealth ceases to be a tool for freedom and becomes a massive administrative burden.
Yeah, the author writes, it becomes an empire that requires management, defense, and endless complexity. I think most people imagine billionaires just swimming in a vault of gold coins, completely carefree.
Like Scrooge McDuck again.
Exactly. But the logistical reality of governing a personal fortune of $200 billion, it's essentially the same as governing a small nation-state.
You are surrounded by a massive bureaucracy of wealth preservation. Armies of lawyers, tax strategists, risk analysts, family offices, security details. You are constantly managing political blowback, fending off lawsuits, and dealing with the sheer friction of allocating that much capital without destabilizing markets.
The author calls that entire apparatus a distraction. A wealth cap structurally eliminates the distraction. It says, lead the civilizational mission, keep the dictatorial control, but let the financial overflow become an automated global public utility so you don't have to spend half your mental energy managing a personal financial empire.
It frees the founder to focus entirely on the innovation engine rather than the wealth preservation engine.
Okay, I have to play the skeptic again here. I understand the psychological argument the author is making, but it feels a bit naive. Do you really believe that someone who has fought tooth and nail to build multiple trillion-dollar companies views their personal net worth as an administrative distraction?
You think it's more about ego?
In the hyper-competitive, deeply egotistical world of tech billionaires, isn't the Forbes ranking the only metric that actually matters? It's a leaderboard. Doesn't the text assume an impossible level of altruism from people whose entire lives are defined by ruthless accumulation?
It is a totally valid critique. The author is absolutely projecting a highly idealized, noble version of founder psychology. But let's assume you are right, and it is entirely about ego and the leaderboard. The author's argument actually still holds weight because the proposal is essentially about changing what is measured on the leaderboard.
Okay, wait. If you change the rules of the game, you change the high score.
Exactly. If the new metric for ultimate status is no longer, I hoarded $300 billion in a trust fund, but rather, my automated overflow fuel successfully eradicated malaria and lifted 40 million people out of extreme poverty this decade, that same ruthless, egotistical drive is simply redirected toward a pro-social outcome. You align the massive ego of the founder with the desperate needs of humanity.
I see. Okay, let's assume the cap works. The psychology aligns, the founders agree, the legal structures hold up in Delaware court. Suddenly we have hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions, globally flowing automatically out of these corporate engines and into these designated foundations.
Right.
That creates a terrifying logistical bottleneck. If you suddenly dump $1 trillion into the traditional nonprofit sector, it would be a disaster of inefficiency, corruption, and slow-moving bureaucracy. How do you deploy the exhaust heat without burning down the city?
The author completely anticipates this bottleneck. This is where the text pivots from redesigning corporate structure to completely reimagining the mechanics of philanthropy. And they start with a pretty scathing critique of how charity operates today.
Because traditional philanthropy is incredibly slow. Big endowments, massive galas, endless grant application processes, years of impact studies before a single dollar actually reaches the ground.
The author contrasts that legacy model with what they call the Mackenzie-Scott model.
Mackenzie Scott.
Yeah.
The author praises her specifically right. She walked away from the Amazon divorce with a massive fortune and immediately started deploying it at a velocity that terrified the traditional philanthropic establishment.
The text highlights her model precisely because of its radical speed and lack of friction. Since 2019, she has deployed tens of billions of dollars. And she doesn't do it by making nonprofits jump through administrative hoops or sit on her board.
She just finds them and funds them.
She identifies organizations doing effective work and wires them massive, unrestricted grants, no strings attached, no reporting mandates.
It bypasses the paralysis of the philanthropic bureaucracy. But the author argues that even the Mackenzie-Scott model is just a transitional phase. We need to go much further.
And going further requires accepting a very specific definition of poverty. The author writes, poverty is not complicated in its core mechanics. It is, in many cases, simply the absence of cash.
That sounds almost defensively simple. But it cuts through decades of paternalistic, bloated development theory. We've spent half a century treating poverty as a character defect or a lack of training or a problem that requires complex, multi-tiered interventions managed by consultants.
The author is saying, no, they just don't have money.
Therefore, the logical conclusion, the most frictionless, efficient anti-poverty intervention possible, is direct cash transfers.
Just take the overflow fuel, the surplus billions from the founder foundations, and beam it directly into the pockets of the people who need it. Cut out the NGOs, cut out the government agencies, cut out the consultants.
And the text provides a massive, real-world technological proof of concept for this, which I found fascinating. India's Aadhaar biometric ID system combined with their UPI instant payment network.
We need to explain the mechanics of Aadhaar because it is the exact kind of plumbing required for this global vision. Aadhaar is an absolutely massive digital infrastructure project.
Right. It provides every Indian resident with a unique 12-digit identity number linked to their biometric data fingerprints and iris scans.
It guarantees a verifiable, unique identity for over 1 billion people. And then you layer UPI on top of that, the Unified Payments Interface. UPI is a system that allows instant, zero-fee money transfers directly between bank accounts using a mobile phone.
The combination of those two technologies solves the greatest historical problem of welfare distribution, which is leakage.
Explain leakage.
In traditional systems, if a government allocates $1 billion for poverty relief, by the time it filters through federal agencies, state governments, local municipalities, and corrupt middlemen, only a fraction actually reaches the recipient. But with Aadhaar and UPI, the money moves instantaneously from the source directly into the biometric-linked digital wallet of the individual.
The transaction cost is essentially zero, and the corruption vector is mathematically eliminated. The text argues that this model, adapted globally, could register the poorest populations on Earth and deliver direct cash payments from these equity-engineered corporate foundations with unprecedented velocity.
Imagine the macroeconomic velocity of money. If $100 billion of surplus tech wealth didn't just sit in a hedge fund buying treasury bills, but was instantly beamed into the digital wallets of 10 million families who will spend it immediately on food, housing, and education.
The demand shock would rebuild local economies overnight.
Which leads to one of the most evocative metaphors in the entire article. The author writes, instead of building a cathedral of nonprofit bureaucracy, you build a pipeline.
Let's build that out because it's brilliant. A cathedral is a perfect metaphor for legacy philanthropy. Cathedrals take a century to build. They are ornate, breathtakingly expensive, and their primary function is often just to glorify the architect or the patron who funded it.
A cathedral is built for grand speeches, for galas, for optics. It is static, and it is entirely focused on the people who are privileged enough to be inside it.
And structurally, it moves nothing. It just sits there.
Exactly. But a pipeline is ugly. It is purely utilitarian. It is usually buried underground, totally invisible to the public. It doesn't have a PR department or a board of directors hosting black tie dinners.
It is highly pressurized, and it only cares about one thing: the relentless, immediate delivery of a resource from a place of immense abundance to a place of desperate need.
The author is arguing that we finally possess the digital technology to build a global biometric financial pipeline. We can route the overflow wealth of capitalism directly to the base of the economic pyramid. And that leads to the starkest moral argument in the text.
The author states, wealth that cannot be spent in one lifetime, or even 10, should not sit idle until a late-stage charity phase. It should move immediately, at the moment of creation, into the hands of those who need it most.
Because we have been culturally conditioned to accept a very specific timeline for wealth. A founder builds their empire in their 30s and 40s, ruthlessly accumulating capital. In their 50s and 60s, they defend and expand that empire.
And then in their 70s, facing their own mortality, they set up a foundation and slowly begin trickling a fraction of that wealth back to the society that enabled it.
The author is calling that delay a systemic moral failure. If the wealth exists today and the technology to distribute it instantly exists today, holding it for 30 years is indefensible. The wealth should flow through the pipeline at the exact moment the company goes public, or the moment the venture capital round closes.
This brings us to the ultimate synthesis of the author's vision. We have unpacked the legal mechanics of return caps, the integration of foundation equity, and the technological plumbing of biometric cash pipelines. If we actually execute this blueprint, what does the resulting macroeconomic reality look like?
The author describes a newly engineered society. Crucially, it is not a centrally planned command and control economy. Markets still function perfectly. Ambition is still rewarded.
Founders still race each other to build the next trillion-dollar artificial intelligence or fusion energy company. The innovation engine is still screaming down the highway at top speed.
But the spoils of victory are systemically captured and redirected. The exhaust heat powers the global grid. The author makes a profound concluding claim. The era of uncapped billionaire wealth and the extreme inequality it generates is not inevitable. It is a choice.
We have a terrible habit of viewing our macroeconomic system like the weather, like it's a natural phenomenon, hurricanes and droughts, that we simply have to endure and build shelters against. But the text aggressively reminds us that legal frameworks, venture capital term sheets, and corporate bylaws are not laws of thermodynamics.
They're just code.
They're a human-written code designed to govern human behavior. And if the code is producing a buggy, unstable outcome like trillionaires existing alongside extreme global poverty, we can just rewrite the code.
The only missing ingredient, according to the author, is collective will. If we find that will, the corporations of tomorrow will not merely be legal fictions designed to maximize shareholder extraction. The text claims they will build a new civilization, profitable, scalable, and profoundly humane.
This loops all the way back to the prophetic opening of the article, the age of abundance. The author isn't proposing a minor tax reform, they are proposing the legal architecture for a new era of human history.
And the text gives us a grounded, granular list of what the compounding output of this system would look like. It's not abstract utopian theory. It translates directly into clinics in Kathmandu,
Schools in rural Bihar,
sustainable housing developments in Lagos,
clean water infrastructure in Yemen,
and frictionless direct cash transfers to millions of families who have never known a day of financial security. All of it funded automatically, continuously, by the massive economic engines built by visionary founders.
It is a vision where the exact same legal sophistication, the army of corporate lawyers currently employed to maximize offshore tax evasion and shareholder extraction, is redirected. That exact same brilliance is aimed squarely at maximizing human development.
We started this deep dive looking at the gravity of Elon Musk. We explored how a single human being can amass enough private sovereign capital to move markets and shape geopolitics. The fundamental question Paraminder Kumar Bhagat is asking is, can we harness that exact same corporate machinery, keep the visionary at the helm, but engineer the system so the output is aimed entirely at human flourishing right now? Not as an afterthought in 50 years, but baked into the cap table today.
It forces us to stop accepting the toxic side effects of capitalism as an unavoidable cost of doing business, and challenges us to engineer a system that demands both relentless innovation from its leaders and absolute equity for its people.
We have covered a massive amount of structural ground today. We moved from the gravity of private sovereign wealth and the three-part equation of founder power, specifically the silent amplifier of liquidity scale and portfolio loans. We stripped down the granular legal mechanics of equity engineering, voluntary venture capital return caps, and Delaware public benefit corporations.
And we followed the money all the way to biometric cash pipelines, replacing the slow, bloated cathedrals of traditional philanthropy.
It is a rigorous masterclass in challenging the baseline, invisible assumptions of how our financial world is coded. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a completely different angle to consider. A thought experiment that builds on everything we've discussed, but looks at a different part of the equation. We've spent the last hour talking about the psychology of the founders. But what about the millions of brilliant people who actually work for them?
You're talking about the global talent pool.
Exactly. If we accept the premise that legal structures are just code, we write to incentivize behavior, what happens to the trajectory of human capital in this new system? Right now, some of the absolute smartest, most ruthlessly driven minds on the planet go to Wall Street or they go to Silicon Valley, specifically to maximize their personal wealth.
They spend their genius designing high-frequency trading algorithms to shave microseconds off a stock trade, or optimizing ad-click algorithms because that is the path to becoming a billionaire.
The current system points our best minds at extraction. But imagine a world where personal wealth was mathematically hard-capped at $50 million across the board. You can never make more than $50 million for yourself. But your capacity for impact, your ability to wield the overflow fuel of your company to change the world, was completely uncapped.
That completely rewires the incentive structure of human ambition.
Right. If you remove infinite financial hoarding from the table, do those same brilliant minds redirect their obsessive competitive drive? If you can't be the richest person in the room, do you aggressively compete to be the most impactful person in human history?
Do we see a race to see which engineering team can eliminate malaria the fastest, simply because that is the new ultimate high score?
Is it possible that our current system of uncapped personal wealth isn't just creating grotesque inequality, but is actually severely limiting our ultimate human potential by pointing our greatest minds at the smallest, most selfish targets?
It's a staggering implication. Does the mirage of infinite personal wealth blind us to the reality of infinite human progress?
Something to mull over as you look at the systems around you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of tomorrow. Keep questioning the code, keep looking for the blueprints, and we will see you on the next deep dive. Remember, the economic machinery might seem impossibly massive, but it was built by people, which means we have the power to rebuild it better.